Hello, and welcome to this Covenant Library workshop on research conversations in church history. My name is Andrew Stout, and I'm your Access Services Librarian. The purpose of this workshop is to give you some strategies for finding good sources for your research paper in a church history class. So first we want to ask the question, what does it mean to talk about research as a conversation? Scholarly discussions take place over time and engage diverse perspectives and interpretations. So research isn't just a process of quote-unquote finding information. It's actually a process of exchanging opinions and perspectives and engaging multiple voices. So research is a conversation that spans time. And in the discipline of church history, that means we're going to want to ask some specific questions. Questions like, what issues were the early church fathers concerned with? And then later, how did the reformers address those same issues? And then how do we, today in the contemporary world, view those issues? So in this conversation, primary sources are the dominant voices, and then secondary sources carry the conversation forward. And then the question is, how do you start to contribute to that conversation? This quote comes from Michael Kibb's book, From Topic to Thesis, A Guide to Theological Research. Kibb says, the conversation into which you are entering via your research paper is far more complex than you realized at the outset. And if you haven't figured that out, you haven't done enough research. So Kibb's right, the research process can be complex, but we're going to try and make it a little bit simpler. So let's start with a potential topic in church history. St. Augustine's view of the Eucharist. What was Augustine's understanding of the Eucharist? This would be a great topic for a research paper. And it might seem like a straightforward process. First you find the primary sources, meaning you find what did Augustine write about the Eucharist, and then you move on to the secondary sources to investigate what have other people said about Augustine's view, how have they disagreed with it or refined it, and then from there you start to formulate your own thoughts about Christ's presence in the Eucharist, or the way the Eucharist should be received, and interact with Augustine's ideas and with the secondary literature that has flowed from that. But with this particular topic, it's a little bit tricky because Augustine never wrote a dedicated treatise or book on the topic of the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. So it can be a little bit tricky to figure out exactly where to look for Augustine's view himself, for those primary sources. So to try and get some clarity on this, we're going to do three things. First, we're going to do some searching in Covenant's catalog. Then we're going to do some searching in the Mobius catalog, and Mobius is the library consortium that Covenant participates in that allows us to borrow resources from other area libraries. And then we're going to do some searching in the Atla Religion database for scholarly journal articles. Okay, so let's start by doing some searching in Covenant's catalog. We're on the library homepage right now. We're going to go down to our catalog list here and select Covenant. We're going to go ahead and select Advanced Search just to a little more easily plug in multiple search terms. Let's start with Augustine and Eucharist. So this pulls up 17 sources, some of which will probably be helpful, some less so. If we look at this first one, Christianity in Rome and Africa, the development of its practices and beliefs. Go ahead and click on it to take a look at the record. You can see my search terms here, Augustine and Eucharist, are highlighted in the record for the book. And the record tells us that this work provides valuable new insights into Church Fathers Tertullian, Cyprian, and Augustine. Including the development of key rituals and practices such as baptism and Eucharist. So that looks pretty helpful, actually. And if you were to take a look into this particular book, Christianity in Rome and Africa, and you looked at the table of contents, chapter 5 here is Becoming a Christian, the Ritual of Baptism. We see here there's a section entitled Baptism in Augustine's Time, with section headings like the ritual, enrollment of catechumens, Lenten preparation, infant baptism, emergency baptism, ministers in the sacrament. So that looks like a really helpful resource actually to give some historical context about baptism in Augustine's time. So that would be one good source. Now we'll go back to our results in the catalog here. The second title is A Holy Trinity in the Life of the Church. That doesn't look particularly helpful. Desiring the Kingdom, Worship, Worldview, and Cultural Formation. Again, at first glance, doesn't look like it's immediately helpful. So we're going to do another search here, just to refine what we did before. We're going to say Augustine, and then I'm going to actually use this LC subject field, and we're going to use the Library of Congress subject heading Lord's Supper. And Library of Congress subject headings are what we call controlled vocabularies, so they make it easier to search for records in a catalog or database. So whereas you might have one author who uses the term Eucharist, you might have another that uses the term Lord's Supper, another that uses the term communion. These controlled vocabularies, these subject headings, are going to help us find all of those resources using one term. So that narrows our results way down, actually. So let's take a look at this first result. Eucharistic Doctors, A Theological History. And again, here's our Library of Congress subject heading for the Lord's Supper. So it's showing us that this book deals with the Lord's Supper. And then we see our other search term here, Augustine, St. Augustine of Hippo. So it looks like this book deals with, at least in part, with Augustine's understanding of the Lord's Supper. And if we go and take a look inside that book, Eucharistic Doctors, A Theological History, and we go to the chapter 5, West and East, Augustine of Hippo and Maximus the Confessor. We see he has a whole chapter that deals with Augustine's understanding of the Eucharist. And here, under Eucharistic Texts, under this heading, the author says that Augustine's most important reflections on the Eucharist are to be found in his Easter sermons, including sermons 227, 228, 228b. So now not only do we have a good source that talks about how Augustine understood the Eucharist, but we also have a clue here about where to go to look for the primary sources. So we've actually started by looking at a secondary source on Augustine and the Eucharist, and that's led us to a primary source, which is Augustine's sermons. Okay, so now we're going to jump back into the catalog. Let's again start with an advanced search. And so this time I know that I am looking for an edition of Augustine's Sermons. So we know Augustine is going to be the author, so search in the author field for Augustine. And you can guess that the title of the work will include Sermons. Let's go ahead and use some limiters. The first one I'm going to use here under location is Covenant Seminary Stacks, which is the main circulating collection, so the books that you can check out. And then material type, we're going to go ahead and say we want to search for books or journals. Alright, so that gives us 8 records, including, if we scroll down a little bit here, we will see Sermons with Augustine of Hippo as the author. And this is a multi-volume work. So this includes a lot of Augustine's sermons. If you remember, we were looking for 227 was one of the sermons that our secondary source told us was a sermon that Augustine dealt with the Eucharist in. So if we look down here at the contents of these books, we'll see that Volume 6, Sermons on Liturgical Seasons, includes sermons 184 to 229Z. So that will include some of those sermons that our secondary source listed as relevant for understanding Augustine's view of the Eucharist. So by searching in Covenant's catalog, we have found some secondary sources that give us information and context about Augustine's understanding of the Eucharist. And then from there, we've been equipped to search for the primary sources, in this case Augustine's sermons, where Augustine himself expresses his understanding of the Eucharist. So we've jumped back and forth between secondary sources and primary sources. So the next thing we're going to do, just briefly, is look at what is available to you through the Mobius catalog. And again, the Mobius catalog is a catalog that lists all the available resources from the Mobius Consortium, which is a group of area libraries that lends resources back and forth. So let's go back to our advanced search and replicate the one that we did earlier for Augustine. And we're going to use that Library of Congress subject heading, Lord's Supper. Again, these are the results we got from Covenant's library. These are the results in our catalog. But if we want to see what's available to you in the Mobius catalog, you can simply go up to this Search Mobius link, and it will replicate that same search, Augustine and the Lord's Supper, in the Mobius catalog. So let's go ahead and refine this search just a little bit. We're looking for books. We're looking for books in the English language. And that narrows it down a little bit. We scroll down here, we'll see Treasure and Tradition, the Ultimate Guide to the Latin Mass. That could potentially be helpful. Also, here's another title, The Beauty of the Eucharist, Voices from the Church Fathers. So here we see our search word, Augustine. So again, this looks like a pretty good source that's going to give us some insight onto Augustine's understanding of the Eucharist. So if you wanted to get a hold of this book, you could just hit request it, enter our library cluster, which for Covenant is Bridges. then from there, you enter your name, your student ID number, followed by our campus code, SC. You select Covenant as a pickup location, and then you can submit that request, and that book will be delivered to Covenant's library. So that's just a quick example of what a great resource Mobius can be in getting you a lot of the resources that you're going to need in your research paper. Finally, we're going to do one last thing here, and we're going to look at the ATLA religion database. So from the library homepage here, we go to Research Databases. We scroll down through this list. The ATLA Religion Database will be the primary database we're going to want to search in for resources in church history and theology. So once again, let's start off with some of our keywords. Augustine. And Eucharist. Go ahead and use this prompt to include Eucharist, Communion, or Lord's Supper in the results. Okay, so we have 151 records. Let's go ahead and limit that down here. First, we will limit the results to scholarly and peer-reviewed journals. We want good, reliable academic resources, and we'll also limit to what is immediately available in full text. So that takes it down to 41 results. Let's quickly take a look at the first result here, the first article, the sacrifice of the Eucharist. The Sacrifice of the Eucharist is an article by Dennis Dean Keenan. It's published in the Haythrop Journal. And if we scroll down a little bit, we see a discussion of Kant's thought, and then eventually we see Augustine and the Church as the mystical body of Christ, and we see that it deals with Eucharistic theology. So this looks like a pretty good source to take a look at to get a better understanding of Augustine on the Eucharist. And then I have the option of either printing off this journal, of emailing it to myself so I can look at it later, or I can save it to a folder. So that's just a quick look at the ATLA Religion Database. Just to review briefly, we have looked at searching for resources in Covenant's catalog, and when we did that, we started by searching for secondary sources, and then we found the primary sources, the texts where Augustine himself talks about the Eucharist. Then we jump to looking at the Mobius catalog to find more books that would be helpful resources for a research paper. And then finally, we searched in the ATLA Religion Database for scholarly journal articles. This is really just, scratching the surface of the research process. If you have more questions about your church history paper, you can contact us in the library. My email is andrew.stout@covenantseminary.edu. I've got my phone number listed there as well. And you can always use the chat function on the library's website to talk with a librarian immediately. So get a hold of us one way or another. We'd love to help you with your research project. Okay? Thanks.